You are listening to the Speech Space Podcast, a podcast full of tips and resources for SLPs. I'm your host, Jessica Cassidy, and this is episode 5. Hey guys, I'm happy to be here today talking to you about mindfulness again. In case you missed the first 2 episodes, I'll link to those in the show notes for today's episode. But in last week's episode, I referenced an article from the Journal of Fluency Disorders that I'm about to talk a little bit more about today. That article is called Mindfulness Training in Stuttering Therapy, a tutorial for speech-language pathologists, and it's by Michael Boyle. I would highly suggest reading this article if mindfulness is something you're interested in incorporating into your speech therapy sessions. Because I know that many of you listening work in the schools, I do want to put out a disclaimer that the methods that I'm going to be talking about are geared toward adults who stutter. It's not that these things wouldn't or couldn't be helpful for children who stutter. It's just that these things would need to be adapted to an age-appropriate level for them, which is totally doable. It's just beyond the scope of this podcast. So please keep in mind those things when listening to these ideas. Let's first discuss a bit about why you might want to incorporate mindfulness into your stuttering treatment. So according to Hancock and Craig, in addition to Yaris and colleagues, relapse is less likely for individuals whose treatment had included cognitive and affective components in comparison to those whose treatment did not have those components. Now, you might be wondering, why shouldn't I just refer my student or client to someone like a counselor who knows more about this stuff? Well, you could, and if you were in an ideal situation where you could work closely together, that would definitely be a great idea. However, we all know that in the real world, that might not be an option for whatever reason. Another reason that I'd like to mention is because in a study by Menzies and colleagues done in 2008, it showed that CBT did help with improving psychosocial measures, but gains in fluency may not result from these treatments when used supplementally. Something interesting that the article by Boyle also addresses is that there are some commonalities between mindfulness and stuttering therapy. That's a really interesting point and something that you should consider if you're on the fence about this mindfulness stuff. So I'm just going to run through some of the applications of mindfulness to stuttering treatment that was discussed in the article by Boyle. Again, I'll link to this article in the show notes in case you'd like to check it out for more details. So the first one mentioned is awareness of everyday activities. This is something that is done to get yourself out of that autopilot mode. You know, sometimes you're driving down the street and you get to your destination and you think, oh my goodness, like, where did that time go? And you just were suddenly there. It's almost like you were in a daze the whole time. So we often go into this mode during our day-to-day actions that we're just so used to doing. And we're not always thinking of what we're feeling or what's going on around us, what we're seeing. We're not taking it all in and being mindful and present in those moments. So this can be a helpful practice in order to get yourself out of that autopilot mode and to increase a connection to the fluency techniques that are being utilized in a more mindful versus an intellectual way. Now, the next one mentioned is a body scan. Now, I love that this is recommended because this is something I've actually been recommending for my older students who stutter for a while. And I think it could easily be adapted for younger students as well. It can be helpful for increasing awareness of tension associated with certain thoughts or feelings. So maybe your student might have a tendency to tighten the muscles of their neck or jaw right before they speak, and maybe they weren't aware of that before. So this might allow them to discover that by becoming more aware of their body and the sensations within their body. And the next one is awareness of the breath. For this one, the client or student would focus on the breath going in and out of the body, while being aware of the rise and the fall of the abdomen or maybe the sensations of the breath on their nose. And this is another one I've been using for a while because I know many stutterers and actually those with a history of vocal abuse or vocal misuse have improper breathing techniques. So a 3-minute breathing space can often be a good one for this one. And if you check the show notes from today's episode, I will have a handout that has recommendations on where you can download a 3-minute breathing space for free. The next one is changing relationships to thoughts. So, when somebody has stuttered for a long time, it's likely that they've developed some thoughts about their stuttering and often many negative thoughts or beliefs. One thing that can be beneficial is training one's mind not to attach to those thoughts or to change their relationship to them. One technique that can be helpful for this is to watch thoughts come and go. You can choose different concepts that work for you, but maybe leaves on a stream and clouds passing by. Those are two that come to mind. With the leaves on a stream, you just you might label a thought, put it on a leaf, and watch it float down the stream. Same thing with a cloud. You kind of assign a thought to a cloud and you just watch the cloud pass by. So you're acknowledging that it's just a thought and it's passing by, and you're making sure not to have an emotional reaction or attachment to that thought at the moment and just to let it pass. The last step mentioned or component mentioned is creating an action plan for relapse. So for this one, Boyle suggests that the client and clinician create a list of actions, behaviors, or feelings that are associated with being empowered and control when speaking, and then another list that has actions, behaviors, and feelings that are associated with relapse. And the list kind of serves to increase the client's awareness of the factors that are essential for catching early signs of relapse before it becomes out of control. He does mention that it's important to remember that the goal here is not to totally prevent any regression from happening, but to know how to handle it whenever it does happen. In an article he quotes by Segal and colleagues, there's a recommendation of a 3-step plan of action for dealing with relapse, and that is to do these 3 things. The first one is to take a 3-minute breathing space. Second thing is to make a choice based on what has been helpful in the past to gather themselves and feel centered again. And 3 is to take some type of action or engage in some activity that will result in achieving empowerment and mastery. So now you might be thinking, this is great information, but I don't know how to get started. Well, I've got you covered. Firstly, I'm actually working on some audio files that are specific guided exercises for stutterers, and I am going to release those probably sometime this summer. Until then, I'd like to recommend some podcasts that utilize some of these techniques that I mentioned today. And I think it's best to listen to the podcast together the first time with your student or client, just to make sure that they're using the techniques correctly. So I will list my recommendations for you in a handout that I will attach as a freebie to today's episode. I'll link to that in the show notes. First is a podcast called 2015 Guided Meditations, and I recommend episode number 2, which is a 3-minute breathing space meditation, like I mentioned in this podcast and in the last podcast. I also recommend episode number 3, where she does a body scan meditation. And there's another podcast called Relaxation by Inner Health Studio. And you might want to check out the body scan and progressive muscle relaxation episodes from her. Unfortunately, there's no episode number to give you, so you'll just have to search for them once you find her podcast. And the last podcast that I'm going to suggest is called Mindful Pause. And I recommend checking out episode, it's called Day 14, Breath Through Diaphragmatic Breathing, and Day 7, Guided Meditation, Tuning into Body Sensation, and also Day 5, Guided Meditation, Paying Attention to How You're Feeling. She also has a 15-minute and a 30-minute body scan on there too, so those would be great to check out as well. And like I mentioned, I will have a handout with all of these episodes and podcasts listed for you. And I might even add a couple more on there, so you'll want to make sure you check out that download. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope that you found some of this information to be useful, and I hope that it's inspired you to try something new in your speech therapy sessions. Check back next week when I'll be talking about the different components of a thorough stuttering evaluation.